Since I'm not the most technologically advanced individual, I was quite proud of myself for some troubleshooting that I did a couple weeks ago during one of our elder meetings. I was preparing to share a video with the elders, and though I had connected my computer to the large TV in the room, I couldn't get the image or the sound to come through on the screen. And for one of the first times in history, I managed to troubleshoot the problem on my own. Yes. It turns out, thank you. It turns out that this TV, and actually, as it turns out, all the TVs in our building need to be plugged in order to function. And I discovered that on my own. Thank you. So you can now withdraw your congratulations if you so choose. So, of course, I've exaggerated the import of my discovery quite a bit, but the point is, TV is not going to function in a vacuum disconnected from its source. There are character traits, as well as spiritual disciplines, that we are often trying to build into our lives because we want them to bear spiritual fruit. But they're not plugged into the source. Or to think in agricultural terms, they're not attached to the root. And one of those traits is generosity, one of our core values. Now, if you read our bulletin every week, and if you pay attention to the little weekly financial update, you'll know that we're significantly behind on our budget for the year. And I would not be honest, I would be inauthentic if I said that this budgetary reality is not part of the motivation behind this 2-week mini-series reviewing generosity this week and next week. Because if it's not up to those who benefit as part of a church body to support the ministries and needs of that body, then whose would it be? At the same time, there are two even more compelling reasons that I want to address this trait again. The first of those is that when Christians are generous, we reflect the heart and character of our God, because He is a generous God who has poured out overwhelming blessing on us. And when we act like Him, it brings Him pleasure and glory. When people say to me, when they tell me about good things that my sons have done, it gives me a lot of joy. And when they say things like, oh, your son reminded me so much of you, first you're kind of like, oh, okay, wait, where's this going? If my wife says that to me, then I know it's going downhill. But if other people say it, it's like, and then they say, because they did such and such, and it gives me so much pleasure, it gives me so much joy when my sons are blessing other people. And if it does that for me and for all human parents, imagine our Heavenly Father and the joy that He receives when His children actually reflect His character, and when they bless others, and when they act like He does. Secondly, generosity is an indispensable. So hear that clearly. It's not optional. It's an indispensable part of how God's people, that's us, about how we worship Him. And I define generosity like this: a heart attitude that expresses itself in the joyful, sacrificial sharing of time, talent, and treasure. You've heard this before. I'm not breaking new ground here. But just to be clear, generosity is the heart attitude. The action that flows out of generosity is giving, right? Or sharing time, talent, treasure. Generosity doesn't grow in a vacuum. And today, from a short account in the Gospel of Luke, we want to discern the root or source of generosity. And I'm going to use the imperfect analogy of electrical current to show 4 factors that affect and enable it, generosity. And again, up front, this analogy is not perfect, and for those of you who understand electricity far better than I, I'm sure you'll have issues with it somewhere, but remember, it's just an analogy. It's a way to help us think about this concept. So we're going to look at the source and the current. We're going to look at the plug and the conduit, or the wires, cables, and finally, 2 appliances. They're sort of parallel appliances that run off of this source. If you don't have a hard copy Bible with you this morning and you'd like to borrow one so you can follow along with our text, The ushers are coming back down the aisles now with some copies, and if you raise your hand, they'll be glad to give you one. And as we often say, I just want to re-up on this again. If you don't own a Bible, I know that everyone can have easy access through smartphones, but if you don't own a hard copy Bible and you would like one, please receive this one as a gift from us and take it and make it your own. I'm going to be reading, as I said earlier, from the Gospel of Luke. It's a short account, and Luke is the only writer who includes this particular account from Jesus' life on earth. He's the only one who brings it out. Part of the reason for that, at least the speculation for that, is that Luke, as a doctor, includes more accounts of healings than any other gospel writer. He's fascinated with God's power over illness, over disease, over the human body. So the story I'm going to be reading is from Luke 17, and it's just verses 11 through verse 19. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us!" When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priest." As they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise, go. Your faith has made you well." The source and current is grace. The grace of God. Grace, by definition, is undeserved favor and blessing, something we could never do for ourselves and which we do not and cannot deserve or ever earn. It's absolutely impossible. This account describes 10 men who were lepers. In the ancient Near East, the term leprosy referred to a broad variety of serious skin conditions and diseases, but the implications of contracting such a condition were terrifying. Many of you have probably heard about this before, but in this cultural context, according to Levitical law, anyone with leprosy was cut off from all human contact except for others with leprosy. They were required by law to maintain distance from other people, to have no close contact, and to ensure that distance by shouting out the word "unclean" anytime that someone was nearby or began to approach them. They couldn't live with their families. They couldn't participate in society. They couldn't earn a living because anything they touched was also then considered unclean and unusable by others. And this doesn't even touch on the possible symptoms and devastation of the disease itself. That just deals with the social implications. True leprosy is a disease, many of you may know this, that attacks the nerves of the human body, beginning at the extremities, usually in the toes and fingers, and then working toward the core of the body, destroying the nerves as it travels, destroying the ability of the nerves to convey feeling and sensation. And often lepers were horribly disfigured by wounds because they didn't feel pain. So they didn't recognize at times when they had suffered an injury or a cut or an abrasion. And then these situations wouldn't be treated and would result in infections and putrefaction. Gangrene could turn a person's appearance truly grotesque. All this makes clear why these men cried out to Jesus, as Luke tells us, from a distance. They couldn't approach him personally. They didn't dare even try and draw near to another human being. Now, in addition to this horrible disease, this one person that kind of becomes the protagonist among the 10, he was a Samaritan, and in addition to the disease, he was also a cultural outcast, right? A foreigner to the Jews, hated. The Samaritans were seen as anathema by the Jews because they were seen as heretics. That's the easiest way to... religious heretics. So Jews had nothing to do with them. They hated Samaritans. They would not eat with them or interact with them. So here comes Jesus. By his grace, Jesus ministers healing to these men. Again, it's healing. Remember that definition of grace, something that's absolutely unearnable, absolutely undeserved, and of which we, or any human being, is entirely incapable of bringing about for oneself. Christ and his grace are the outlet and the current, the electricity from which generosity will eventually spring. See, we too have been healed by the grace of God from a disease for which there is no cure. The disease of sin and perversion and rebellion, which we have chosen. Unlike the lepers in this story, they had not chosen this disease. Every human being has chosen the disease of sin and brokenness and rebellion and death, which leads inevitably to destruction, to darkness, and permanent separation from the light and love of God. His grace, through salvation, and his continued relationship with his people is what ultimately will make generosity on our part possible. Next, we're going to talk about the extension cord. So what's plugged into that socket that carries the current to where it needs to go. There's a very important point in this narrative. We're likely to miss it if we're not up on our Levitical law. It has to do with when the healing actually took place. Jesus tells them to go and show themselves to the priests, and the text says, as they went, they were healed. Now, according to Levitical law, given by Moses, governing skin conditions and leprosy specifically, any Israelite that was suffering from any kind of skin condition was unclean, as we already discussed. If the condition or disease resolved itself, if they recovered, if their skin became clear, they were still considered unclean until they had gone to the priest. So they had to go to the priest for an inspection, and the priest would look all over them and ensure, kind of give his stamp of approval that they were truly clear of this condition or this disease. And then the priest would then declare them clean, and they would offer the appropriate sacrifices there at the temple, and they would be able to return to normal life. But in this case, Jesus tells them to go to the priest while they're still unclean, right? The visit to the priest is supposed to occur after healing. It's supposed to occur after a person has already been cleared up of the condition. Jesus does it backwards. He's like, hey guys, I hear you. Go show yourselves to the priest. I don't know what they were thinking. They must have thought, his eyesight might not be that good. Maybe he can't tell that we're not clean yet. But it's as they begin to head to the priest that they're fully healed. The extension cord that conducts the power of generosity is faith. These men trusted Jesus. And how was their faith revealed? How do we know that they trusted him? Because they obeyed him even when it didn't seem to make sense, even when logic would have dictated otherwise. And their faith is revealed as faith is always revealed, in obedience to what God says. And we see faith just surrounding this story. It's what Jesus indicates at the very end when he says to the man, rise, go, your faith has healed you. And their reaction to start going to the priest, even though they were still leprous. Faith is not about a feeling or positive energy or trying really hard to force ourselves to manifest a positive outcome in a given situation. We get very confused about that sometimes, that we think faith is about me just really, focusing positive thoughts. Anytime that some tragedy occurs and there's a politician or somebody, newscasters or whatever say, we just want that person to know that our thoughts and prayers are with them. It's like, what good are your thoughts going to do for the person? My thoughts and prayers are with you. A few weeks ago, I was in the Starbucks drive-thru, and it was a barista that I've encountered far more than I should, because I'm in that drive-thru far more than I should be. And I could tell that she was a little down that day. I know her name. And I said, how can I pray for you? And she just said, just pray for positive vibes. And I said, actually, I won't pray that for you. But I'm going to pray something better. I'm going to pray the blessing of God for you. And she's like, okay, that's good. Somehow we have this idea of faith that it's like positive vibes, or good energy, or I'm like when we see here where Jesus says to the man, your faith has healed you, what we picture that meaning is that just in his mind, he's just like focused on that outcome. Okay, I just got to believe and I'm going to be healed. Believe. Come on. Envision, right? Picture my healing. Bring it about. That's not what faith is. Faith is faith in Jesus. And faith in Jesus will be lived out in obedience to him. It's not faith in an outcome. It's faith in him. Faith is about trusting Jesus and obeying him. James, in his letter, addresses this idea about the relationship between faith and action. In James 2, verses 14 through 17, he writes this: "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." So James here, he's not implying that anyone is saved by what they do. That's very clear. We know that nobody is saved by their actions, by what they do. But what he's saying is, if faith is genuine, if it really exists, if you claim that you believe in Jesus, if you claim to belong to him, then that will naturally and inevitably outplay in actions, in a changed lifestyle, in obedience. Each child of God has responded to God's grace with faith. It's essential to our salvation. Verses you're very familiar with, Ephesians 2, 8 through 9. "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith." There we see that relationship. Grace, which is the initiative of God and his work. Faith, our response to it, to simply accept and receive. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Even faith is a gift. Grace and faith both are gifts from God. Not by works so that no one can boast. You're not saved by what you do. But the way we act is evidence of our salvation. It's evidence of our faith. Faith expressed in obedience will be crucial for lives of generosity because Scripture commands God's people to generous giving. Of course, the goal is that our actions, right, external, and our hearts are going to line up so that our desires are in line with our actions. But it can take time to make that happen. So there's a person I highly respect. His name's Pastor Sean Yost. And he has a lot of phrases that I love to quote, but one of them that he uses a lot, I don't know if he coined it or not, but everything good is uphill. Right? Everything good is uphill. That makes sense, doesn't it? It requires something of us. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything bad is downhill, but everything good is uphill. And there are things that we choose to do in response. Because of our faith in Christ, we respond in obedience, even if perhaps initially we don't feel like it. There's a lot of things in our lives that we do this way. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but when we're teaching our children the concept of gratitude, how often have you as parents said this, or have you heard others say this? What do you say? Someone gives something to a child. What do you say? And we never ask them, right? Do you feel like saying thank you right now? Oh, you don't feel like it? Okay. Well, let's wait until you feel like it. No. We teach them because it's the right thing to do. It's an obedient response. There are many, many things in life that we all do, even though we don't feel like it. So faith is the connection that conveys the current from the source to our generosity. Now, in this account, there are two appliances that we see powered by the grace of God. Now, again, this is not a great analogy. I acknowledge that. But the first of these appliances, if you want to say it, that's empowered by the grace of God through faith is pretty obvious in the story. It's gratitude. We're supposed to focus, right, on one of the 10 lepers. Why? He stands out from the rest because he's the only one that turned back and came to Jesus. Now, why did he do that? To thank him, to express gratitude. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. Jesus comments on the contrast. 10 were healed. And as though he didn't know, where are the other 9? This isn't a very high percentage, right? This is not a passing grade. This is 10%. And the phrase came back, that only one came back, that's a meaningful phrase. The other 9 continued on their way. They were enjoying, I'm sure, their newfound health, celebrating their healing, focused on their future, excited, understandably so, perhaps to get back to family, to be reunited with loved ones. But in the midst of all that excitement and joy, only one intentionally came back where? To Jesus. The other 9 experienced his grace. They did, his healing. But they experienced him from a distance. And ironically, not only did just one experience Jesus personally and intimately, but it was the Samaritan. Right? It was the Republican. Or it was the Democrat. Right? Depending on your perspective. An attitude of thankfulness and intentional expression of that gratitude brings people closer to Jesus. It brings us closer to him. It causes us to pause while following our own desires and plans, and it makes us pause even while we are enjoying the blessings of his grace, and enables us to recognize the source of each and every blessing. Gratitude arises in us as we recognize just how great God's grace toward us is. When we realize and remember that we've been saved from an inevitable fate from which we were incapable of saving ourselves, and no one else could do it either, and Jesus did it, he paid the price, how should we respond? And while we may be aware of his grace and sacrifice, there's an intentionality in choosing to turn from our regular routines of life to focus on expressing that gratitude. Just like we do with kids, like stop, hold on a second. You've just received, hold on. Before you go on and enjoy that brownie or that candy bar that you were just given, what do you say? What do you say? And for kids, it's not just for kids, it's for adults too. But when we think about it through a child's eyes, when is their gratitude or their response most genuine? It's when they realize how great the blessing actually is that they've received, or how much they've desired this particular gift that they've just been given. And the same is true for us when we recognize and realize, spend time actually thinking about what we have been given, that we respond in gratitude intentional gratitude, a coming back, a returning to Jesus and saying, thank you. Now we arrive at the second appliance that needs the source and current that feeds off of faith. You've probably guessed it by now, but it's generosity. Generosity and gratitude are very closely linked. The single ex-leper returns in gratitude, thanking Jesus, but I want you to notice how he returns. What is he doing? He came back praising God in a loud voice. So this is pretty extravagant. And it's interesting if you think about it that he has been transformed in how he uses the volume of his voice. Up until now, what has the volume of his voice been used? For what purpose has it been used? Unclean, unclean, unclean. Right? To keep people away, to isolate. And now, perhaps for the first time in years, he is freed to lavish his voice to draw near to the King of Kings and to the Lord of Lords, even if he doesn't fully realize who this person is yet. And his praise is loud, and it's lavish, and it's not just verbal, but it's also physical. He throws himself at Jesus' feet. He's close. And Jesus understands in this response that there's another embedded action that accompanies, but is slightly different from gratitude. And it's the action of giving. Because this is what Jesus says, has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Giving, again, is the action resulting from the heart attitude of generosity. As the healed man falls at Jesus' feet in gratitude, giving praise to God, it's not begrudging, it's not because it's demanded, and it's not an attempt to repay Jesus, because what Jesus has done is far beyond repayment. Repayment is not the kind of giving that results from a generous heart. Repayment is a burden, a pressure, can lead to resentment. It's not something that's demanded. We recognize that there is no way we could ever repay Jesus for his salvation, his death in our place, his generosity toward us, his grace, but we can celebrate him and all he has done. And generosity begins with giving praise to God. That's where it starts. Because of everything that we've received, we respond, it overflows back to him first. And I know I've talked about this before. I just want to remind you that praise is unique. We often combine the word praise with other words. Praise and worship, for instance, and that's accurate. Praise is part of worship. Absolutely it is. We often also equate gratitude and praise. And they're related, but they are a little bit different as well. Thanking God is what we should do, but praising God is something else we also must do. And praise, the easiest way to define praise is to just simply begin the sentence of praise by saying, God, you are, and then fill in the blank. And it's interesting, if you sit down and decide, okay, I want to intentionally spend time just praising God, how hard it is actually to keep from going into thanksgiving. Not that that's wrong. Please hear me. I'm not suggesting that's wrong. But thanking is actually a more natural response for us than praise. Praise simply reflects the grandeur and the glory and the character of who God is. Thanksgiving is a response of what we have received. Right? And so this praise is the first act of a generous heart. And, even in worship, we can become very self-centered. A lot of worship songs, or songs that are called worship songs that are being produced, really, they have us as the center. They have me as the center focus of the song. And we call it worship, but who or what are we worshiping? Where's the attention drawn primarily to me and my feelings and what I'm going to do and how I'm going to act and what I'm going to propose and what I need? And we rarely spend time praising God, just reflecting back to him because of all that he is and all that he's done. Could it be that you have tried and even been trying to be generous, but you've been trying that in a vacuum? In other words, generosity grows within us as a result and a response, a result of being united to and with and aware of the source. The work and grace of God on our behalf, received by faith, enacted in obedience, expressed in gratitude, results in generosity of heart, first toward God and then overflowing to others. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at this same passage, but also a couple of others to figure out what the enemies of generosity are. Because there are many, but they kind of all resolve into one thing that we can kind of, here's a spoiler alert, we can kind of summarize it by saying self, me, and a self-focus, and a selfishness, and a greed for self. But the challenge today, that's next week, so you don't have to worry about that unless the Holy Spirit's really convicting you. You can wait. But the challenge today, the invitation, is for us to look back to the source, to remind ourselves and be reminded of just how great the grace of God is, and how his gift of grace and his gift of faith to us are where it starts. That's where we focus. Because if we're trying to just be generous without even knowing why, or we're trying to be grateful without even reminding ourselves for what we're being grateful or to whom, that's going to be a fruitless effort. Look back to the source. Remember the work and grace of Jesus on our behalf. Thank him. Give him generous praise, which is the first act of generosity. Let's stand. As we do intentionally praise this King, this source of grace, for all that he has done and all that he is. And the altars are open. And if you would like someone to join you at the altar and pray with you or for you, come to this side, or else come to the other side and you'll be left to worship and pray on your own. But let's praise. Let's remember the source with gratitude for God's grace.